welcome to DIY slipcovers. Normally we make slipcovers. Today we're going to be teaching you how to make a witch hat. If you're going to buy a 60-inch wide fabric or a 54-inch wide fabric, decorator fabric, you'll want 1 yard. We're using a velvet chenille upholstery fabric. It has a little bit of weight, so it's going to stand up nicely on the cone, and it's going to give the brim the right structure we need. You can use polyvelvet or any good weight fabric. Then you're going to want 12 gauge wire. You can find this in the floral section or jewelry making, even at the hardware. And we're going to use it around the brim of the hat to keep it stiff. And we are going to be putting it in with the lining of our hat so we can shape the cone. Then we picked up some embroidery thread. We're going to use this around the brim of the hat, which will hold our wire in place at the edge. You can stitch a pocket instead on your machine, but this gives it a really cool handmade look that we're after. And then you'll need a yard of lightweight fabric if you want to line the inside of the cone, and this will also be where you'll sew your wire into the seam allowance. We are just using a quilt fabric in cool Halloween black. And then we used netting on the original hat we made. I don't think we're going to be putting a netting veil on today. I actually had sewed it to the ribbon first and then attached the ribbon to the hat. We're using a 1-inch, little over 1-inch satin black ribbon for around the hat. You can make a bow if you want. You could just fold it over at the back and then put a stitch to hold it. The other embellishments you can put on your hat: feathers, leaves, flowers, twigs, natural elements from your yard. You just tack them all on if you want, however you want it to look. We're also including a pendant on the top of our hat. You can put a drop jewel like this. I used a metal leaf on the original hat, but I think today we're using this feather. Now we're going to cut the paper pattern pieces that are available as a PDF download on our store, DIY Slipcovers on Etsy. The brim piece is only made up of 3 pieces of paper. You tape those together, matching up registration lines and the pattern lines. They are A, B, and C. D, E, and F are the pieces of paper that you tape together to make the cone pattern piece. And you'll cut 2 of the brim pieces on the fold. It's notated on the pattern, as are the seam allowances. And then you'll cut 1 of the cone piece on the fold, and then 1 cone piece out of lining if you do want lining in your hat. Now we want to cut 2 pattern pieces out of the brim piece, placing the edges on the fold. It's notated on the pattern, and lifting up your fabric. Make sure you have fabric underneath where you're cutting. After you've cut your cone piece from the lining, we are going to finish the bottom edge by turning it up and pressing at a 1/2 inch. Okay, now I pinned my two brim pieces together, right sides together, and I'm going to stitch around the edge all the way around and lock the stitches about 1/4 inch in. Now we're going to turn the brim right side out and press at the edge. Since we only used 1/4 inch seam allowance, we don't have to trim it or put clips in it or anything. We can press it down. It'll lay really nice. So now we want to sew both of our cone pieces. If you did a lining piece, I'm starting with that. I'm keeping the hem turned up the 1/2 inch and I'm stitching up the long side of the cone. I'm going to do the same thing with the face fabric, and then when I finish the face fabric, I will trim the very tip at the top of the cone just so that when we turn it right side out, we can get a really good point on our hat. Now we're going to put a piece of wire in our brim. We're going to cut the wire just a little bit longer than around the outside edge of the brim. We'll overlap those wires inside of the brim, and we'll sew around that with either using the machine and sewing inside the wire to create a pocket for it, or once you have it all pinned around on the top of the fabric to hold that wire in place at the very edge of the brim, you can hand stitch with the embroidery thread around the edge of the brim, and it gives it kind of a neat, that's the handmade look we were talking about. And there's different stitches you can use, from a whip stitch, running stitch, blanket stitch, and those stitches can be found online. Now we want to pin the cone good side to the brim, and you can use either side of the brim, whichever one you want up. Before doing this, I went ahead and stitched the inner circle of the brim about 1/4 inch in from the raw edge, and I clipped all the way around that inner circle every about 1.5 inches, and when we sew the two together, that'll help us ease it in smoothly. Now we're going to sew the cone to the brim that we've already pinned. Take your time. I like to put the cone on top, sew every couple inches, and then lift my foot and readjust everything. And don't be afraid to mush the wire at the outside of the brim. It can all be smoothed out when you're done sewing. put the wire into the seam allowance of our cone. When we sewed our cone at a 1/2 inch, the hem is turned up and the inside of the hat faces your noggin, so the outside just goes right into the hat, and then we're going to stitch the bottom edge to the brim where the 1/2 inch is to finish the inside of the hat. So we can put our wire in the side seam, and we already sewed it at 1/2 inch. And see that yellow thing sticking out? That's actually a folded piece of fabric. I put that in there, and then I reinforced the bottom of it, stitched across that, and then I stitched up on the very outside edge of the fabric, and then zigzagged it, and I stopped about 2 inches from the top of that hat. So then I'm going to cut a piece of wire about 2 inches shy of the bottom of the hat and 2 inches shy of the top. And I'm going to bend over the bottom of the wire so it doesn't poke through, and I'm going to slide it into that opening, and then I'm going to bend the top of the wire as well. And then at the top, I'm going to cut off that yellow piece right at the edge of the seam, and then I'm going to insert it back at the top and stitch over it again to reinforce that pocket. And then I'll clip that off. In this segment, we're talking about finishing the brim. We have sewed the cone to the brim, and then the wire is pinned into the outside edge of the brim, and we finished ours with a blanket stitch that we used embroidery floss for. It holds the wire in place and it gives it a rustic look, but you can finish it on the sewing machine or you can use a different stitch. If you can see in the video, we used a blanket stitch. And then I talk a little bit about the cone of the hat. You can adjust the pattern when you cut the cone to make it sit more upright. If you're not going to put any bends in it, the reason why we made it longer in the back is so that when we did put our bends in the hat, it wouldn't shorten the hat and make it look anything other than a witch hat. So you can lay that pattern piece or your sewn piece flat with the seam at the back and trim it off even at the bottom if you want a straight up and down hat. Or you can put the pattern piece, lay it differently with the longer side of the pattern piece for the cone on the fold, and then put the seam at the other side on the shorter side. And then when you create the cone, it can be just like a straight up jetted away from the front of your face, you know, like a really tall wizard hat. So you have some options. So the lining is pinned all the way around the inside of the brim to cover the seam allowance, and I'm going to whip stitch it in place by hand. So our hat is pretty much finished. One of the last things we did was to sew the lining down at the edge of the inside brim just to cover our seam allowance and tack the lining in place. Charlie picked her finishes for her hat. We just tacked on a ribbon, and she didn't want many bows or flowers or anything, so she just put in a few feathers and sewed the metal feather from the top of the cone. You can do whatever you want with your hat, be as creative as you want, and please send us photos. You can send them to our Etsy shop. We are DIY Slipcovers, and we do make furniture slipcovers if you're interested, and you can buy our pattern there as well for less than the price of a fast food lunch.